Welcome to the 2025 Jack Quarter Lectureship on the Social Economy. On behalf of the Center for Learning, Social Economy and Work, or CUSO, and the Program in Adult Education and Community Development in the Department of Leadership, Higher and Adult Education here at OISE, we're very happy to be holding this year's lectureship as part of the OISE Graduate Student Research Conference. We're also thankful to Professor Sergio Montero, Director of the Institute for Inclusive Economies and Sustainable Livelihoods, for co-sponsoring this lectureship, which is also part of the series of events on talking inclusive economies we've been co-hosting this week. So this is the last event of those. Many thanks also off the top to the hard work of postdoctoral scholar Valentina Castellini and doctoral candidates Justin Holloway and Delanga Segretti for helping make tonight happen. I want to open tonight's event with a land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So to recognize the land on which this public university resides is an expression of gratitude and appreciation for those whose territory we work and live on, and a way of honoring the Indigenous people who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. It's important to understand the long-standing history of colonialism that has brought us to reside on the land and to seek to understand our place within that history. Colonialism is a current ongoing process, and we reflect on our mindfulness of our present participation. My name is Marcelo Vietza, and I'm an associate professor here at OISE. I'm co-director of CUSO, and I'm chair of the Department of Leadership, Higher and Adult Education. I'm honored to introduce the 2025 Jack Quarter Lectureship on the Social Economy, and to warmly welcome and thank this year's lecturer, Professor Jason Spicer, who so readily and kindly agreed to come and speak to us and make this trip from City University of New York. First, allow me to say a few words about the lectureship. The Jack Quarter Lectureship on the Social Economy is in memory and honor of Professor Jack Quarter, who passed away in early 2019 as full professor in adult education and community development in the Department of Leadership, Higher and Adult Education here at OISE. For over 50 years, all of them in Boise, Jack was a friend and colleague to many of us in the field of adult education, community development, and the social economy. A renowned researcher, prolific writer, and much-loved teacher, Jack mentored hundreds, if not thousands, of Canadians and others from around the world studying or involved in social and solidarity economy. Jack helped co-found several groups that have been making a deep impact to Canadian society and scholarship, such as the Canadian Worker Cooperative Federation, the Canadian Association for Studies in Cooperation, the Association for Nonprofit and Social Economy Research, and its journal, the Canadian Journal of Nonprofit and Social Economy Research. Jack was also one of the research leads of the Cross Canada multi-year and multi-site Social Economy Hub initiative, which helped conceptualize and map the social economy in Canada. He wrote or co-wrote dozens of books and articles on the social economy, workplace and economic democracy, and labor issues, including co-authoring the much-read Understanding the Social Economy in Canada, Understanding the Social Economy, a Canadian Perspective, and Understanding the Social Economy of the United States. Before his passing, Jack was also a finalist for the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada's Impact Award, a very prestigious award recognizing the highest achievements in social sciences and humanities research, knowledge mobilization, and scholarship. The Jack Quarter Lectureship is cared for and organized by the Center for Learning, Social Economy and Work, which Jack helped co-found. It is generously made possible by a donation from another renowned scholar of Canada's cooperatives and social economy, George Melnick, at the University of Calgary. We thank Professor Melnick for his kind donation and patience. Professor Melnick only had one stipulation for how to use the funds for the lectureship: hold it at OISE in Jack's memory. So we're thankful to OISE, to Dean Erica Walker and her staff, and the Graduate Student Research Conference organizers for their enthusiastic support in holding the 2025 Jack Quarter Lectureship. And now, it's my pleasure to ask one of our brilliant graduate students, Iram Chorgai, to come and introduce Professor Spitzer. So let me introduce Iram. Iram is a settler, writer, and researcher pursuing an MA in adult education and community development here at UAC. Their research explores the potential of cooperative models and student unions, examining how these models can strengthen student advocacy and institutional resilience. Iram has co-authored a publication in the American Journal of Archaeology, contributed to Horizons magazine, the Capilano Review, and Silverfish magazine, and led policy, advocacy, and research initiatives in nonprofit and educational settings. As the founder of the Deckham House, a youth-led newspaper focused on Toronto's local food systems, and a facilitator of community workshops, Iram is committed to bridging scholarship, activism, and public engagement to reshape our relationships to each other, to learning, and to the land. Here.
I am very happy to be introducing Professor Jacob Spicer, the 2025 Jack Quarter Lecturer on the Social Economy. Dr. Jacob Spicer is assistant professor at the Marxe School of Public and International Affairs at Baruch College at the City University of New York, and in the Social Welfare Ph.D. program at the Graduate School and University of Technology. He was previously assistant professor at the University of Toronto, where he was the founder and director of the Community Economies Lab. His work has been published in a number of leading social science journals and featured in media outlets such as The Washington Post, PBS Newshour, The Conversation, CBC, Governance, Grist, Fast Company, and Foreign Policy. Before becoming a professor, Dr. Spicer had a 15-year career in the global urban development industry based in New York City, working with local, national, and transnational government, private sector, and third sector organizations in a variety of capacities. Dr. Spicer's research and teaching focused on the relationship between politics and the economy at multiple spatial scales, from the local to the transnational. He primarily studied the potential of alternative economic models, such as cooperatives and social and solidarity economy organizational forms, to create a more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable economy, and the role policy and political processes play in conditioning the viability of alternative economic arrangements in different contexts. I'd now like to ask the 2025 Jack Quarter Lecturer on the Social Economy, Dr. Jason Spicer, to come to the podium.
Well, thank you for that warm introduction. It's a pleasure to be back here in Toronto. The title of my talk changed between the time I originally was asked to come and agreed to come and what it is you now see on the screen, which is the role of research in making the social economy matter in a world on fire. And you can probably imagine some of the things that have changed in recent months that might have caused me to change the title and the substance of my talk today. So my talk is going to have two parts. The second part of my talk will be more about my book that has recently come out about cooperative enterprise and comparative perspective. But the first part of my talk is going to be about why we should be doing anything other than just feeling like nihilists and sort of saying, who cares? Why does research matter? What even is the social economy? All of that. Because in the moment we're living in, there's a temptation to feel that way. And I want to remind us that actually we can't feel that way. We owe it to one another and to the rest of our species and the planet to remember that there's a role for us all to play in healing a really sick world that we're in right now. So to start, just to name the moment that we're in, and the page here is intentionally ripped of Jürgen Habermas's The Legitimation Crisis, written a half century ago, because the steering system between capitalism and liberal democracy is coming undone. and has been raped. And that was Habermas's point a half a century ago, is that the way liberal capitalism has worked for centuries, it has been an uneasy marriage between liberal democracy and a deeply undemocratic capitalism. And it is held together by an agreement between political, economic, and intellectual elites, providing justification and cover, legitimacy for the steering system, which sometimes falls apart and needs to be reinvented. And we're living in a moment where we are again going through a legitimation and legitimacy crisis in that system. And again, the title of my talk is on the role of research. Research has played a pivotal role in keeping the system alive and afloat, particularly research from powerful academic disciplines at elite institutions, including economics, sociology, and political science, which are three fields which my work typically engages in. And we're having a moment right now where elite economists like Angus Deaton, a Nobel Prize winner who spent his career at Princeton University in the School of Public and International Affairs, has written upon his retirement a mea culpa. Maybe economics and social sciences got some things wrong. Maybe trust our legitimacy and expertise, that free trade will be good for you, that free movement of people will have no consequences, that unfettered technology will solve all your problems. Maybe we got that wrong. And maybe we should have paid more attention to the costs of all of these things, the human costs and the human toll. And social scientists did not do enough to acknowledge there would need to be responses in policy to dislocation and suffering, human suffering in different countries. And that maybe that is part of the reason why democracy is under assault. Because democratic elites, democratic small d, not a democratic party, but democratic elites, have basically provided the cover and justification for these policies, saying, yes, trust us, it will work out. So there's a realization that something is wrong, the system isn't working. And it's really quite remarkable, though, that even in these mea culpas, where Angus Deaton says, oh, maybe unions do have a role, we don't hear about things like cooperatives and alternative ownership so much. And the reason that's surprising is fellow members of their elite, like Yale political scientist Robert Dahl, one of the greatest political scientists of the 20th century, at the twilight of his career, said that we would be highly unlikely to be able to sustain political democracy without a corollary economic democracy. That argument has been re-echoed in the decades since Dahl made that argument by Noam Chomsky at MIT, saying quite simply, you can't have meaningful political democracy without functioning economic democracy. So as that marriage between capitalism and democracy is coming undone in this moment where the world seems on fire, the world is literally on fire. The marriage between capitalism and the planet is also not working. And yet again, as Jason Hickel, the economic anthropologist based in Great Britain, reminds us, we still have calls to fix this problem that capitalism has been causing for the planet with more capitalism. So what's extraordinary about capitalism, as he says, is that it produces ecological breakdown and then tries to sell itself as the only reasonable solution to ecological breakdown. Marvelous contradictions. Right? And yet still we're told we just need to fix the capitalism. We need better capitalism because there's no alternative. And these elites that have brought us this seem to not realize that another economy might be possible. And I don't want to seem like I'm beating up on elites too much because they're human, right? And just like us, it is very easy when you're living under a system to lose sight that another alternative is possible. As Ursula Le Guin, the science fiction writer, said, "We live in capitalism. Its powers seem inescapable, but so do the divine right of kings." And it's in moments like today when we appear to be in a Gramscian conjunctural crisis, when all of these colliding crises come together, where we have perhaps a thin place and we realize there is potentially another economy that's possible that we can transform the world to be. And that is the social economy. And that may seem like a long lead up to the social economy, but I realize we have a diverse audience and some people may not be familiar with the social economy. So I wanted to start with that overview. So how I conceive of another economy, an alternative economy, is as follows. We can divide the world of the economy, the traditional economy. We might think of the private sector as being dominated by capitalism and IOFs, or investor-owned firms. We might also think of an alternative as a public sector economy, a state economy, as at one extreme could be under communism, but there are lesser variants of that with, for example, state-owned enterprise. The point of the social economy is that there is, in fact, an alternative, a third sector, a third part of the economy, which goes by different names depending on your intellectual or academic tradition. And part of the point of my talk today will be in this first half, that while there are differences between these different naming conventions I have on the board, there is more in common than not. And we need to start working across our differences to knit together a truly comprehensive social and solidarity economy. Now, at the heart of the social and solidarity economy, of course, are cooperatives, which I imagine most of you in this audience are familiar with, but they run on the same principle as political democracy: democratic participation in governance, one person, one vote. They coordinate amongst themselves to get to scale. So there's 7 principles that they run on. And cooperatives come in many varieties and then have many cousonages that together form the social and solidarity economy. It's endless. We have endless naming variations. We have consumer, producer, worker cooperatives, multi-stakeholder cooperatives, and then related forms of community and social economy ownership, which I have listed here. And again, that other economy is already here. Right here in Toronto, you may recognize some of these names as enterprises that are part of the social and solidarity economy here, of course. And around the world, and sometimes in particularly large scale, with the notable example of Mondragón from the Basque country of Spain, the world's largest worker cooperative, SEWA, Self-Employed Women's Association, India, with hundreds of thousands of women members there. And then even in the United States, Ocean Spray, of course, which brings cranberries the world over, is a foreigner-owned cooperative. Cooperatives, of course, were the first sector to recognize the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations back in 2016. And they committed to that globally, but right here in Canada at their convening in Quebec at the Summit of Cooperatives. And the economic benefits and externality effects of these models are well known and well studied, as some of my research has shown. They're associated with higher positive externalities, so worker morale and voice, productivity, downturn resilience, as well as lower negative externalities and negative consequences such as economic inequality, gender inequality, and employee turnover, churn, and absence. These business models, though, require different policy rules, and this has been a core part of some of my research today. They coordinate to scale differently than other businesses. They have a different relationship to society. They need to maintain links to social movements to keep from experiencing mission drift. And they generally require different policies from governments at all scales, from the local to the transnational, which respect their unique operating logic. So perhaps I'm preaching to the choir, right? Everyone's like, yeah, sounds great. We need to do it. Why do we need more research? So why would we need more research? I just presented a ton of research. We know these things are better. Well, I would submit to you that we still have a lot of research work to do because these things still are not the dominant model anywhere, are they? Right? We have a long, long way to go. And in making social economy research matter, we need to recover what Ben Flaubert calls practical wisdom. Ben Flaubert is a scholar of urban planning, and it's an Oxford Business School. And he argued that social scientists in general have forgotten practical wisdom, or what Aristotle called phronesis. We tend to focus on episteme and technique, but not phronesis. So we need to recover a phronetic approach to make social science matter by embodying practical wisdom. We need to ask ourselves, whose research questions are we asking? How are we asking and answering them? And for what purpose? And part of the reason we need to do this is because people who don't share our values have been very good at doing this. It is easy to think that the nationalist, racist movements from the right wing that we're seeing around the world, including south of the border, are coming from rabid zealots like the person pictured here. But the reality is that's only part of the story. They're the product of systematic research and careful planning over decades by scholars and scholar activists who understand phronesis and practical wisdom. People have been freaking out over Project 2025 as if it's a new document. But picture here is the first Project 2025, which has always had the same subtitle all along, Mandate for Leadership. The first one came out in 1981. It's been being updated by the Heritage Foundation every few years. Careful, systematic, patient research. That first one was actually drawn from Richard Nixon's AIDS manual in 1973. Goes back even further. And I can't help but notice the corollaries between this careful planning, which is bringing seemingly an end to the era of globalization. Our second effort at globalization. The parallels between that and the end of the first globalization, in which modern research techniques originally reached their disturbing zenith. If you saw the recent film, The Zone of Interest, about the final solution, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's a dark and disturbing history, but the same research techniques we're seeing from the right today were on offer and exhibit a century ago, as first described by the great late Zygmunt Bauman, the social scientist, in his groundbreaking work, Modernity and the Holocaust, that showed that that was brought to us again by careful, systematic research. So to be people who have done this in the past and are doing this again, we need to be better and up our game at research as well. And we need a theory of research. We need to be able to operationalize phronesis. And we need a theory of change. And what I want to share with you now is my theory of research and my theory of change for the social economy and how to realize a more comprehensive social economy. My own theory of research is rooted in the work of the late Donald Stokes, who was Dean of the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton. And he argued that we could divide research into 4 quadrants based on whether it was fundamentally concerned with understanding or with use, right? So if you're fundamentally concerned with understanding but not with use, that's Niels Bohr, the model of the atom. If you're fundamentally concerned with use but not understanding, that's applied research, Edison and the light bulb. But there's another quadrant of research that's simultaneously concerned with both use and understanding, what he called Pasteur's quadrant, named after, of course, Louis-Marie Pasteur, who linked the theory of disease and germs to pasteurization. They were trying to do both of those things at once. That is the type of theoretical model I try to adopt in studying the social economy. And I link that to a theory of change also rooted in public and international affairs, public policy, and the thinking of John Kingdon. So John Kingdon, a central figure in developing global policy scholarship, including in education policy, created the multiple streams framework, where he argued there were 3 streams that needed to come together to achieve change. And I argue we need to apply this type of research theory across the 3 streams. The first is the problem stream. We need people to understand that the conditions they're experiencing under capitalism are problems. Somebody's got to do that conversion work. There's the policy stream, where we need to have a set of solutions, technical policy solutions that have been vetted and approved by policymakers that speak to those problems. And then there's the politics stream, where political elected officials and political will needs to be there to take the policy solutions to a problem and enact them. And so you may think, that sounds nice. You've said a lot of fancy theory with a lot of fancy sounding names of people at fancy institutions. Let's get down to brass tacks and talk about what you actually need in practice. So I'll give you an example upstream. In response to the outcome of the American election, a lot of politicians and political actors in the United States have been arguing that the problem and policy streams were too focused on the concerns of people who shower before work instead of people who shower after, right? Meaning elites, white-collar elites who shower before they go to work, as opposed to people who shower after a long, hard day of working and getting sweaty. And this isn't my framing. This is the framing of an emerging reader on the progressive left in the United States. And the argument is the election in part was lost because the Democratic Party did not understand the concerns of the masses of people who were voting. And what they've done is compare systematically with voters over the last few months, even in the run-up to the election, every single issue compared against the cost of living and inflation was a loser. The number one concern people had was their pocketbook. It was the economy, right? Focusing on all of these other issues, which you and I care about a lot, was not landing. The framing in the problem stream wasn't there, right? And so we weren't highlighting enough the policy solutions that spoke to those problems. So what does that mean for the social economy? It means the frame that I opened with about economic democracy is a loser, right? So I may think that's amazing and important and sounds great, and all of these important people who I'm trying to name to make my work get taken seriously matters. But regular working people say, I don't care. I hear what you're saying. I have bigger concerns. So when we're thinking about framing the social economy, and this is everywhere, right? Inflation has been everywhere. It's not just in the United States. We need to frame it in a way that speaks to people's fundamental concerns. And specifically, in the problem stream, where research on stories, frames, and narratives can be so powerful, we need to be asking questions such as, does the public even know what the social economy is? Who does and who doesn't know? And what frames, stories, and narratives can we adopt to resonate with more of them? We need systematic research, phonetic research, Pasteur's quadrant research that attempts to answer these questions, right? If you're big with Qualtrics or Leger panels, right? There's a project for you, okay? On the policy stream, the technical stream, which social economy models work best for which problems? What policies need revision? How should they be revised? We don't have particularly compelling answers to all of these questions, either in ways that make sense to someone in the public who isn't steeped in this material the way that some of us are. And we also need to think about cross-cutting questions and concerns related to feasibility, coordination, and integrity of use in these different social economy models. And what I mean by that, and I'll walk through a couple examples, is we need to shift in our thinking from always asking either or binary questions to asking both and questions and answers. For example, when we research scale in the social economy, there tends to be a divide between people who are focused on small is beautiful, right? Mutual aid networks, wonderful, wonderful things. And those of us, which tend to be people like me, who are focused more on questions of scale. We need to be big. We need to be like Mondragon. Yes, it comes with drawbacks, but we need to achieve economies of scale to transform the economy. And too often, in research conversations, these two things are cast as enemies. And, oh, it's either or. It's either mutual aid networks. I want to do a mutual aid network. I never want to be like Mondragon. That's gross, right? Because there's certain imperfections in their model. No, there's an empirical question there. When do we use one model or the other? If you're a policymaker, you say, when should I be providing policy support to mutual aid network? And when do I need to be thinking about larger enterprises? I don't think we've done a very good job in answering that question in the same way. Another situation where either or thinking is a problem is we often tend to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We're comparing models regardless of scale. So we've got Mondragon, the world's largest worker cooperative. But then we have models like Publix Supermarket in the United States, which runs with employee stock ownership plan. Publix is larger than Loblaws and all its subsidiaries put together, and it's 80% owned by the employees. That's pretty incredible. Comes with some drawbacks. Models like John Lewis and Partners, largest retailer of its kind in Britain with almost 100,000 employees, uses an employee ownership trust model, which now has been enabled tax policy here in Canada. When should we be using one or the other? I see bad behavior, and I've tried not to be part of it myself on both sides of this question where, no, it should all be a worker co-op. No, it should all be an EOT. Again, there's an empirical question as to when we should be using what model and when. And in some of the consulting work I do with applied practitioners and trying to not translate and mobilize knowledge from the academy, this is something that they'll say to me. They're like, I don't care about these academic food fights y'all are having. I want an answer. I want to know which model works. Should I be using this or that? Tell me. That's what we need to be thinking about. And I've also gotten the opportunity to work on some projects like this. This is just a screenshot from an alternative ownership enterprises study. I was a technical consultant with Transform Finance, ranking all kinds of different models for funders in the US, Canada, Britain, philanthropic funders to help them understand when they should use some of these models. Haven't been able to figure out how to do a both and turn that into academic research. That's okay. Sometimes it doesn't need to be. Other times we can do both and research, like some of the research I did on community land trusts in the United States and Canada, where I and students and a collaborator were able to partner with community organizations in both the United States and Canada to produce censuses of all community land trusts of both countries that could be useful to policymakers standing up and being counted and understanding their scale and scope. And now we're in the process of being able to turn those into academic outputs as well. The first paper on community land trust in the United States has been published, and a paper on Canadian community land trusts about to come out in a few weeks based on that data as well. We were able to raise money as well to give back to all of the respondents, which is an important part of doing this type of research. And again, I know this corresponds with a graduate student research conference. So I just want to say, when you're applying for funding, please always try to remember to include those social economic organizations in your budgeting. And sometimes when you can't, you can find ways to give back in other ways. I did a study with a student of worker cooperative policy ecosystems and entrepreneurial ecosystems in Toronto and Montreal. We didn't have the budget, but we did win a prize for that article. And then we were able to publish some public outreach scholarship on it as well. And we donated that money because we didn't have the budget. So that was another way you can use academic resources to get back to these kids. And then finally, when we're conducting this kind of research, and my final point in this call to action for more effective research before I turn to talking about my book a bit is in terms of actually living and walking the talk, right? And theory versus personal practice. And when I moved back to New York, right, I had Alterna as my bank here in Canada. I opened a bank account with the first mutual bank in a century in the United States, Walden Mutual Bank, which funds regenerative food entrepreneurs in New England and New York State. And I was able to move in Jackson Heights, Queens, into a resident-run, self-managed housing cooperative pictured on the screen. And part of the reason I say this, I'm not trying to be holier than thou or aren't I so wonderful, but no, I try to put this into practice. And I think if you're researching this, you're trying to put this into practice. If you're researching it, you need to put it into practice as much as you can as well, because not just to practice what you preach, but to understand the barriers and challenges in enacting this, and to have understanding to people who may not have the luxury or privilege to be part of the social and solidarity economy. The reality is, where's the word capitalism come from? Who knows? Where's the root come from? Yeah, go ahead. Right, and caput, the head, right? And it's the head of the system is rotten. As the Italians say, pesce puta dalla testa, the fish stinks from the head down. We're all living with this smelly fish around us, and we all have to make our compromises and be hypocrites in this system. And part of getting out of that system is acknowledging that to practitioners so that we can get more effective research and ask better research questions to remove those barriers. So that's kind of the first half of my talk about making the social economy research matter in a world on fire. And I now want to talk about my book about cooperative enterprise in comparative perspective with the subtitle Exceptionally Un-American, which came out hardback a few months ago. And the title of the book really could have been How Structural Racism Has Held Back the Cooperative Movement in the United States, which is really, if you take one thing away from the book, that's what I'd like you to take away. And again, in asking questions of phronesis, how and why did I come to write a book about books? Whose questions was I asking? Why did I ask and answer them in this way? The book started 14 years ago when I was living in New York and got involved briefly with the Occupy Wall Street movement. And if you remember, that was another conjunctural moment where things seemed possible and change seemed possible. And one of the things that came up again and again in assemblies and conversations was the question of alternative ownership models. Right? How could we get a worker and community-owned economy? And people would get very excited. But then they would also say, yeah, but we're not very cooperative in America, are we? Like, we just don't seem to do that very well, do we? And I thought, oh, yeah, maybe there's something different about the United States. There's some American exceptionalism at work in cooperatives that got me to thinking about this question that my fellow participants were asking. But then I pushed back on that because the reality is the United States has a rich history of collective action and in incubating collective action models, union models, and have inspired movements and labor organizing the world over. The civil rights movement, union organizing, and the founding of the country, collective action in the Boston Tea Party. So I wasn't so sure if it really was American exceptionalism at work. And by American exceptionalism, I don't mean America being better. I mean America being different, which is a concept that goes back to Tocqueville more than 200 years ago, who observed that there's something different about the United States. And political scientists have long studied American exceptionalism. Why does America always seem to operate a bit differently than everywhere else? So that was the reason for the subtitle of my book. It's a little bit of a dog whistle political scientists that I'm trying to speak to them. So I turned to social science research on co-ops to see what I could find to answer this question. And what I found was rich descriptive historical work on cooperatives. It was tremendously valuable and inspiring. I found explanatory work as to co-ops' benefits or consequences. But what I didn't see was explanatory work in terms of the causes or enabling conditions for cooperatives to succeed in a meaningful scale to transform the economy. And didn't see research using core theoretical methods in the social sciences as driven by scholars at the institutions that we're all chasing and trying to make legitimize our work. It's an unfortunate, nasty part about this academic business that we're in, always chasing that legitimacy. Right? And social science also still matters, not just to academic elites who have the ear of policymakers, but in general to policy processes at large, as we continue to know. So the first thing I did was measure, right? I measured the prevalence of cooperative enterprise scale. And what I found was that little red dot circled in the lower left-hand corner, the US was pretty weak. And I saw some countries were far stronger. Canada's a bit better than US, much better. Finland, New Zealand, and France were off the charts. And I wrote a very long, boring academic article, which if you're ever struggling with insomnia, you can read called The Cooperative Enterprise at Scale, Compare Your Capitalism to Political Economy of Ownership, where I did two things. One, I built a regression model to predict the probability that a large business would be or not be a cooperative across the rich democracies, which again, some of these scholars in political science and sociology I was citing earlier, they tend to look at those countries together. And I found statistical significance related to policies that embody economic liberalism, related to different dimensions of social heterogeneity, related to size and remoteness, as well as industry fixed effects. And I just want to draw your attention to factors in particular, economic liberalism and race. They were among the factors that were significant statistically in all the models I ran. So that was part one of that study. Part two, I then traced how these factors manifest in the policy frameworks of the US as a case of comparative failure against 3 comparative success cases, which exhibit some variation across these causal dimensions. And that's Finland, France, and New Zealand. And what I found was that systematically, the US had an incomplete and inadequate cooperative policy environment compared to the success countries. You don't have a comprehensive enabling statute at the national scale or in the states. You have policies that encourage cooperatives to demutualize in the US, not so much in the other countries. When the government decides to privatize something that was state-owned, they don't involve the cooperative or social economy sector in the United States. They do in other countries. They restrict access to finance that would be the most natural sources of finances for cooperatives. They restrict access to equity and debt. They don't provide equitable access to procurement contracts in government. And then they don't impose cooperative-like restrictions on investor-owned firms that other countries do. So there was a systematic problem that made cooperatives in the United States feel like they were on the strong bus, as one of them said to me at one point, where they wind up in what Darren Acemoglu, who just won the Nobel Prize on MIT economics, would call a vicious institutional cycle instead of a virtuous circle, where cooperatives have an incomplete national policy framework that restricts their ability to raise money, which then means they're more restricted in being able to create business development and technical assistance support, which leads to weak market performance, which leads to ineffective lobbying and advocacy, and a cycle begins anew. And I do just want to note, as an aside, I didn't mention in the policy chart or here the role of education, and I'm mindful in the School of Education. That is another dimension that I would love. I think someone should really take very seriously and comparatively study the role of cooperative and social economy education in primary, secondary, and tertiary education systems, because I found in my field work, the qualitative part of this study in my book, that is also an enormous difference across countries. Yes, that's just a side note. So as a result of this, in the United States, and this is a quote to open chapter 2 of my book, it feels in the United States like you're running up the down escalator with our hand behind our back. Pick your cliche. America claims it's the land of equal opportunity, a level playing field that only applies to certain types of businesses. Sometimes I feel like we don't stand a chance. So, with that long preamble and all that work, which I spend the first 2 chapters of the book introducing, I asked a different question in the book, which is, how did the United States end up this way? Why is the United States like this? Why is it different? Now, statistical analysis was good for a current cross-sectional analysis, but there is no statistical database of all cooperatives over time in these countries, so I could not do a panel data model statistically. So instead, I adopted an empirical qualitative approach that compared to the historical approach, a central case with comparisons. Central case being the United States, and Finland, France, and New Zealand were the comparative cases. Again, 4 rich democracies. That's to take knocking away from the extraordinary movements for solidarity and social economy in the global South. But again, I'm trying to speak to the core of disciplines in sociology, political science, and economics. They tend to study the rich democracies together. So the data, I conducted 173 interviews. I analyzed over 1,200 primary and secondary historical documents, many in specialized archives not digitized in different languages. And I tested for the effect of those known statistical factors from my statistical study to see if I could find evidence that they were appearing or not over time. And I framed it and operationalized it using 2 key academic theories about institutions and change, 2 of the 3 new institutionalisms coming out of political science based in the work of Harvard and Stanford political scientist Seymour Martin Lipset, and subsequently political scientists Jacob Hacker, Kathleen Bellin, and Paul Pearson, as well as its competitor, sociological institutionalism by Neil Flickstein and Doug McAdam. These are 2 competing theories that get cited tens of thousands of times. And again, why did I frame it using these theories? Going back to phrenesis, going back to Pasteur's quadrant, I wanted to ask a question that mattered to actual participants in these movements, but in a way that would get the elite gatekeepers of these disciplines to pay attention to this question. When I was studying this and I started in graduate school, I was told not to study this because it was too marginal and weird. I would not get a job. I would not get published, right? So I was like, well, I need to convince some of these people that this is a serious thing worthy of study, that they should take seriously. So in studying it this way, I'm trying to pave the way for future students to never have a professor say to you what was said to me, for the students there in the audience. So when I adopted those frameworks, I looked at the cases. I'm going to very briefly talk about the comparative cases before I go to the US case. And I want to talk about similarities in the 3 success cases across their differences. And what I found was that co-ops claim an opening or an unclaimed space, an unclaimed field space in the economy during a wave of action in those success cases. An apex body or a meta-organizing body acts as a field-building champion and organizes for national cooperative development policy. The sources of these voids in the economy and the sources of solidarity for organizing support, it varies across the case countries. Okay, so that's at a very high level. And with a bit more detail, they specifically, in all 3 cases, harnessed an emergent national economic solidarity of organized resources and build power, right? And they were able to organize or claim field space that wasn't already claimed by an incumbent in language of field theory business model. That would occur in different ways across the cases in terms of timing. Sometimes it happens in a big bang or a revolutionary moment. sometimes slow evolution over long periods of time, produce gradual developments that also enable cooperatives to slowly build up an infrastructure. But the timing matters, whether it's evolutionary or revolutionary. You've got to get a minimum degree of organizational coherence and establishment before competitors have organized to block you from organizing yourself in the economy, to grab a toehold before you're blocked out. So what happened in the United States? Why is America so uncooperative? Why is America so difficult? Why does America have such a virulent strain of capitalism as well? And my argument, again, we can organize all of our institutions into three spheres. This is a framework I'm drawing to get from Habermas, as well as political theorist Colin and Water. We can think of all institutions being either an economy, state, or civil society. Cooperatives are in the intersection of the three first-order fields in the economy. My argument is only in the United States did co-ops face two well-entrenched field incumbents in the economy with respect to economic ownership models in their first waves of development during the first round of industrialization in the United States. These two other competing ownership models, which gave birth to economic fields, were far more entrenched in the US than anywhere else. And they prevented and blocked cooperative organizers from activating the solidarity needed to procure resources of various kinds, policy, finance, as well as adherence. Those two models that were more entrenched and more well-developed in the United States, the first, of course, is investor-only firms and businesses. I review the statistical data historical to show that the investor-owned model, the firm, was far more entrenched and developed in the United States at an earlier date than anywhere else on the planet, including at the point that the cooperative model was being institutionalized. But there wasn't just one competitor. There was a second competing ownership model, which was also entrenched through the 19th century when cooperatives were trying to take root. And that was the race-based ownership model of chattel slavery, of other human beings as property, which was supported by a whole set of social and political institutions, right? And that continued those relationships even after the formal end of slavery through Jim Crow institutional relationships that existed until the civil rights era just 60 years ago. And as a result of this different field environment, American cooperation never fully got off the ground and has struggled in subsequent waves of development to fully overcome these initial obstacles in the field environment. And I trace this in the book from the beginning. What we see from the very beginning is American exceptionalism in cooperation. There were four strands of early cooperation. So there were cooperative communities, so whole towns, the utopian socialism, which gave birth to separately to modern urban planning, producer associations, which became worker cooperatives, cooperative stores, and mutual financial institutions. Three of those four strands were associated with early key field building champions. And they struggled to develop the cooperative model everywhere, but particularly in the South. And what I have pictured here on the map is one of the four strands. It's cooperative communities that were utopian socialist in nature. And the chloroplast map you're seeing there is actually the percentage of the population that's enslaved. And basically, anywhere where there was slavery, you did not find utopian socialist cooperative communities. The same pattern holds across some of the other types of cooperation as well, right? And part of the reason is obvious, because the most likely participants in the cooperative movement at that time would have been working people. Working people in the American South were not free to join because they were enslaved because of their race. But we had few instances of white cooperation in the American South as well. It's not just cooperative communities, but it was producer associations as well, which was the forerunner model to worker cooperatives. Up through the middle 1800s, there were no worker cooperatives in the South. On the eve of the Civil War, there was only one. So why was this a problem not just for the South, but nationally as well for the cooperative movement? What happened is there were two field builders. Before the Civil War, it was the communitarian movement. After the Civil War, it was the Knights of Labor. Both of them framed the fight of cooperatives as being against wage slavery, meaning you had an employer and you were an employee, as well as against race slavery. And this framing nearly destroyed the communitarian movement. It's very clear in the historical record. And it does wind up directly destroying the post-war field builder, the Knights of Labor. For the communitarians, they had infighting as to whether they should eliminate wage slavery first or race-based slavery first. And this dominated all of their debates and organizing efforts. And part of their problem was the existence of industrial slavery in the American South. There was a misnomer that the American South before the Civil War was an economy of plantations, and that is where slavery occurred. That is untrue, as I review in my book with historical archival material. There was substantial industrial slavery in the South, and that made it difficult to organize the white working class, who were also working in industry, because they could not deny or escape the consequences of what was being discussed by the communitarians and subsequently the Knights. Was it directly affected them. And as a result, the framing of the cooperative movement as fighting both race-based slavery and wage slavery activated a simultaneous animus against both early capitalists as well as slavery supporters simultaneously, and resulted in them having to fight a two-front war. The Knights of Labor, right after the war, that took up the mantle from the communitarianism movement, they were responsible over 2 short decades for producing fully 1/4 of all worker cooperatives in the historical record through the 1980s. They also formed thousands of cooperative stores as well. And they were the first multiracial national labor organization in the United States. They also inspired Knights of Labor organizing around the world, including here in Canada. They would know where the first chapter of the Canadian Knights were. I'll give you a hint. I think someone commuted in from there this evening. Hamilton, correct. So they were tremendously successful, and their goal was to eliminate both race slavery and wage slavery with cooperatives. And in the 1880s, they marched into the American South, causing violent reactions sometimes by having black and white knights joined hand in hand, saying what they were going to do is going to enact a black-centric but biracial cooperative plan to organize former plantation workers as well as former industrial workers, i.e. slaves, along with free labor. Right? It was perhaps the first instance of an attempt at a great replacement of white ownership of black labor with multiracial collective ownership. Up until that effort, this was hailed as the world's most advanced labor movement. If you know your Marx and Engels, Engels would write endlessly about how the Europeans were in awe of the American labor movement. They seem to have skipped over so many stages to having such an advanced labor movement. But what happened is they rapidly declined after their march into the South failed. They were met with white domestic terrorism, martial law, mass murder of their participants, as has only recently been covered in the historical record, highlighted a community in Thibodaux, Louisiana, where the massacre in the sugarcane fields there. What had then been the most advanced labor movement in the world receded quickly and never fully recovered. The American cooperative movement never fully recovered either when their champion fell apart, right? And this is the moment when American exceptionalism with respect to cooperativism takes roots, and it's directly linked to the development of a particularly virulent form of capitalism, a racialized capitalism, where we lose cooperatives as embodying a lost strand of what political theorists would call negative liberty as non-domination. Other capitalist countries have a more robust cooperative strand that tempers the extremes of capitalism. And that notion of cooperative liberty is not in the choir of economic voices from this point forward in the United States economy to temper a virulent form of capitalism. So we get a late organizing cooperative movement. The Knights are replaced by the American Federation of Labor. They kick out all black people. It is an all-white movement. They explicitly demote and remove cooperatives as the fourth plank of their agenda. As a labor movement, the racial element is very clearly in the historical record a reason why, right? And big labor in the United States would formally avoid the South and race for half a century after that. They would also dramatically stop referring to wage slavery. And again, my earlier point, we have to frame to win, right? But we have to be careful not to abandon our values like the American Federation of Labor did. Can't win at all costs. The result was there was no field champion in the United States to advocate for cooperatives, even as industrialization, a second industrial revolution was occurring, and even as a world-leading antitrust policy that embodies economically liberal principles that limit the ability of firms to coordinate with one another took root in the United States before anywhere else. And that undermines cooperatives' ability to cooperate with one another across the supply chain to get to scale. So we then get a splintered cooperative movement by race, region, and type. We get separate white and black cooperative movements, Southern farmers cooperative organizations that are segregated by race. And the only areas in which American cooperation has any success are the white parts of the movement. White farmers movements, white utilities, white consumer cooperatives, white credit unions succeed. But black Southern farmers, black Northern consumer credit unions, black credit unions, as the work of my CUNY colleague Jessica Gordon-Nemhart has shown, were sabotaged and attacked by whites. They were also inhibited from legally incorporating due to Jim Crow legal restrictions on cooperative legislation. And furthermore, while we finally did get a new field champion to replace the Knights of Labor, Cooperative League of the United States, CUSA, they did not initially want to engage with the Black cooperative movement either, right? Which further undermined a unified cooperative movement in the United States in the middle 20th century. When they finally did, new problems emerged. By the middle of the 20th century, there was a tax war being waged by white capitalists against cooperatives in Congress. It's very clear in the congressional debates that continued from the 1950s to the 1970s to restrict cooperatives' ability to take advantage of certain tax policies the way other businesses did. As a result, there were just 12 worker cooperatives in the 1950s. They were largely white. And when there were multiracial organizing efforts, even through the 1970s, which we think of as the countercultural wave, there was again a racial division and discrimination in evidence there as well, as recovered by Stuart Perry in his work on garbage cooperatives in that time period. Today, there have been some improvements, but these issues still remain. There have been repeated campaigns by Acorn to deal with the fact that Southern cooperatives are, their boards, Southern electrical cooperatives are 90-some-odd% white, even though they're a far smaller share of the population, with limited success. There have been infighting between cooperators related to race, where a prominent Black female cooperator was sued. It was a race-related lawsuit by a white male cooperator, the local cooperative movement, a really recently book. And instances of white supremacy and non-white worker cooperative organizing as well. Some of the details are in my book, but again, as a note to students, sometimes informants and respondents will tell you things you can't put in the book And some of these instances I was not able to put in the book because they were too sensitive to put in. As a result, today, the field leading apex body in the United States, NCBA, the successor to CUSA, still has never had a leader of color, and worker cooperatives and all cooperatives still remain weakest in the American South, as I review in my book. And that is despite the sustained effort of many generations of Black cooperators, from W.B. Du Bois, pictured in the upper left, to Albert Baker in the lower left, who of course developed many of the models I'm sure you studied here at Marxe with spade work, ways to approach community leadership. She was also a famous cooperative organizer in New York City. Fanning Hamer with Southern Cooperatives in the center, to again my colleague today, Jessica Gordon-Nephart, pictured at right, who is a scholar activist for the Black cooperative movement and the cooperative movement writ large. And this shows up in profound ways. This is just a quote as I'm getting towards the end of my talk here from one of my informants. Co-owning in worker cooperatives is probably going to be the last place where we see success, because there's this hangover from past generations, this lack of negative liberty, of non-domination that people have been socialized into with the virulent strain of American capitalism that is racialized. This quote, it's another thing, it's entirely to talk about co-owning your place of work with a Black person. This is where white supremacy and white discomfort with Black people will be the last to go. This is where solidarity will be the hardest to achieve. And one is reminded of Karl Marx's quote from the 18th Brumaire, right? People do not make their own history. They do make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. The traditions of all the dead generations weigh like a nightmare on the brain of the living. Or as James Baldwin said, people are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them. So to wrap up, conclusions, the comparative cases all had some similarities. Cooperatives are able to organize to national solidarity, leverage an unclaimed space in the economy at key moment in time to form a coherent national movement. In the US case, a field champion does not emerge till late. Incumbents related to investor ownership and racialized ownership produced a hostile environment for cooperative development and policy. And as a result, in round after round of organizing efforts, there are weak policies for cooperatives that we're constantly trying to remedy in ways of activity, never fully remedy the incompleteness of the past. So the implications for theory and action. For theory, my argument is that the cooperative case helps us reinterpret US labor history more broadly. It helps us understand why American capitalism is so harsh and how the lack of cooperatives in American capitalism played a role in that process. And for action, I posit that we're unlikely to build a stronger cooperative field in the United States without a joint fight against the two problems that have undermined it from its very beginning, racism and economic liberalism. And how we're going to address that is probably by centering Black and people of color voices in a working people's movement to address that. And it's the intersection of those two things, centering voices of color in a working people's movement, that will be key, right? As Adolph Reed, the political scientist at the University of Pennsylvania, has long argued, it's the intersection of race and class in the working people's movement in the United States. And we need to avoid what Femi Tyro, the Georgetown political philosophy professor, calls elite capture, where we have only elite voices in movements of identity speaking on behalf of working people of all colors. Thank you.
So